right, guys. So, as I was mentioning, what we're going to be talking about today, the incidents in Portland this past weekend and the weekend before in Los Angeles, but then there have been a number of incidents in both Portland and Los Angeles involving these white supremacist groups, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, these junior clan. I like to call them junior Klansmen, right? Because they wish they could be the Klansmen of their granddaddies and great granddaddies, but they are just not built like that. But they are still scary nonetheless, and they are dangerous. Not only to anti-fascist people who meet them in the streets, but they are dangerous to people of color. They're dangerous to Black people. They're dangerous to women. They're dangerous to our gay and trans friends. They are dangerous, period. OK. And the fact that the police allow them to behave this way knowingly and usually without consequence, if any at all, is something that should bother us all. OK. And one example of this today, if you could cue up A1 for me, please. Not even a week ago, gang, a white supremacist, I'm not clear whether or not he has any affiliation with any of the aforementioned groups, but he was white supremacist racist nonetheless, rolled up to DC and parked his pickup truck on the front steps of the Library of Congress, right? And do you know what the police did? They talked to him for 5 hours. They said, "Hey, buddy, it's okay, guy. Just tell us what's wrong, guy. What's the matter? You hungry? You want a pizza? We're going to bring you a cell phone, homie. You just sit there and you just take your time and you just tell us what the problem is, guy. Don't you worry." Now, listen, it's not so much the fact that they negotiated with this guy for 5 hours. It's the fact that they would have never negotiated with a Black person or a brown person for that duration of time without injuring them in some way, right? This guy threatened to blow up his truck on federal property, and everybody just gave him all the space that he needed, right? I want you to take a peek at this video. This video was compiled by one of our guests, Vishal Singh, and it really illuminates how law enforcement deals with avowed white supremacists threatening violence versus Black and brown people who are unarmed and not posing any threat besides being Black and brown in America. So Tunde, can we please take a look at A1, please?
Chief of Capitol Police was asked about a motive for the Trump supporters' bomb threat across from the U.S. Capitol. Here is his answer.
We do know that Mr. Roseberry has had some losses of family. In his, I believe his mother recently passed away, and we spoke with members of his family, and there were other issues that he was dealing with. There'll be more on that before at a later time.
Meanwhile, here is the far-right extremist himself outlining his political motivations while live streaming on Facebook.
Joe Biden, you don't fucking believe nothing, man, but this number's on you. I called your office, I called you 911, and they think it's a fucking joke, but I'm telling you, bud, the South's here. There's 5 of us spread it all across your little DC part here. You keep on letting all these illegal Mexicans in here, all these illegal immigrants from Afghanistan. Now, I'm gonna tell you, all y'all fuckers out there saying there's a revolution, well, I'm building a fucking foundation. Don't come, you can explain it to your kids. This blood's on your hand, Joe Biden. We can make a deal. You step down out of office, I'll step down out of this truck. You go home, I'll go to federal prison. I'll tell you what they want. First thing they want is airstrikes in Afghanistan. Your military expertise built this. Your military expertise, Joe. All by decimals. I'm glad you got them sirens out from around here. It was kind of making me nervous. Because I don't want to die. But I ain't scared to die.
Floyd Ray Roseberry of North Carolina facing some federal charges, but very much alive and well and uninjured after his 5-hour standoff when he was threatening to detonate his truck on the front grounds of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., not even a week ago. Guys, that, again, like I said, that video was compiled by Vishal Singh. Vishal is joining us today from Los Angeles, and we are also joined today with journalist Shauna Salisbury, who was covering the Portland, I don't even know what to call it, a demonstration. It wasn't a demonstration. I'm not exactly sure what to call it, Shauna. So, but I appreciate the both of you making some time to join us today to talk about these escalating events and gatherings of white supremacists and the people that are coming out in the streets to meet and fight them. So thank you both for making some time. Shauna, thank you for making some time on some short notice. I really appreciate it. Shauna, you're muted, darling.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you for having me on again.
Awesome. Vishal, can you hear me as well?
I can, and same thing. I thank you so much for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
Oh my gosh! Now I see your face, Vishal. I want to run my fingers through your hair. I'm sorry. My bad for making this awkward. I just said, "Ooh, look at those locks." No, run my fingers through them. Gorgeous hair. Anyway, you guys, I appreciate you both being here. And Shauna, let's start with you because you were actually on the ground in Portland. Shauna, you've been covering all kinds of these gatherings of these white supremacist group, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. I'm not even really sure what to make of this. So talk to us about, let's start off by what was known coming into the weekend. It seemed like all Portlanders knew that something was going to kick off on the 22nd. And I'm just curious as to what was known. What did you know before this weekend? And tell me what you were able to observe.
So the 22nd, which was Sunday, was the of the last street altercation that there was between Proud Boys. There was like a lot of QAnon. There were a lot of different groups that were out there the last time, this time last year. And so this event was sort of branded as like the 1-year anniversary since all of these events happened. And originally it was the Proud Boys, I believe, that started planning, and they wanted to make some sort of Summer of Love barbecue is what they were kind of branding it as, to hold in downtown Portland. And so anti-fascist protesters scheduled a separate event to be held downtown as well. And actually, as of, I think it was Sunday morning, when the event was supposed to take place, that's when the Proud Boys decided to switch the location to have the event to an abandoned Kmart parking lot in Northeast Portland.
I want us to take a look, guys, at a compilation of some videos. One of where the first video clip is going to lead with a local news report from, I think it's KOIN, Coin News 6. And it's going to be followed up with a couple of other videos, one from an independent journalist, a cat with news, Sean Carmichael, who was able to capture footage of an active shooter. There was a man shooting, I'm not sure at whom or arbitrarily, out on the streets. And he was detained by police, and we will see that. But the police chief of Portland had announced even Friday, in anticipation of the weekend, that Portland police would have a very limited role in being the peacemakers, so to speak, between the anti-fascists and the racist groups that came to town. Tunde, if we could please take a look at A2.
Portland police do believe that these protesters will be down in downtown Portland tomorrow. Specifically, they think they're going to be in Tom McQuall Waterfront Park, but that they could move anywhere downtown, as we have seen that in the past. If you take a look at this video, we know that these opposing groups, police are reporting that they have brought dangerous and even deadly weapons, including guns, to these kinds of events. And this is video from a couple of weeks ago of these groups clashing in downtown Portland, but this kind of behavior among them has been going on for years. So in response to knowing about these planned protests, the mayor and police chief held a press conference about it. And after being pressed by reporters, Portland Police Chief Chuck Lavelle says that they're going to take a hands-off approach to this protest tomorrow, and police won't be seen in the middle of the crowd trying to keep people apart.
People should choose to act peacefully, even with those they disagree with. People can and should keep themselves apart and choose to avoid physical, violent confrontations. My message today is simple. If you're considering coming downtown to fight, threaten people, or participate in violence, stay away.
Put your arms out like an airplane at your sides. Face your palms towards the air. Yes, ma'am. All right, cross your ankles. We're going to keep you here for a minute. There's more guards coming. We're going to take you into custody. If you reach for anything, we're going to shoot you. Any other weapons on you? Got it. Crossing. You're fine. Relax. You're all right. Hey, I need you to back up right now. Guys, thanks for staying back. Appreciate that. Hey, if anyone was a witness to this original event, we'd like you to stand by here on the sidewalk so people can talk to you. Guys, I need you out of the street. If you're going to be out here recording, that's fine. Over here.
You good? Don't be taking pictures of me, motherfucker. Point him that way. You're not helping me at all.
Where were you guys when you knew they were coming today? You knew they were coming. You could have prevented this. You could have prevented this.
You're pointing at me. I am not the chief of police.
Go get him then.
I can't get him. I know. I don't have his phone number. I don't know where he is. I'm trying. We got the guy in custody. He pointed the gun at you, right?
Yes.
Do you want him prosecuted?
Am I the only person that would be allowable to prosecute him right now?
Did he point guns at other people?
It's a fire shot.
Striking scenes coming from Portland, Oregon over the weekend. That final clip was shot by journalist Shane Burley. The two clips involving the active shooter was shot by a cat with news. His name is Sean Carmichael. And the first one was KOIN News 6 in Portland. Vishal, I wanted to ask, seeing, we just saw two white men in different cities threatening violence. One actively was dispensing violence in the form of firing a handgun in a public street. And somehow the police managed to arrest and subdue these men without injury, without killing them. And we know that had the suspects been black or brown, that outcome would have been much different. But given in addition to the events in Portland, which I know you were following very closely, similar incidents and events have happened in Los Angeles. And what has been your observation of how the police deal and interact with these groups, even when they are obviously threatening violence to innocent people who happen to be in proximity? It seems very chummy, and the police seem very, very gentle with these individuals who always happen to be white from my perspective.
Yeah, so I've covered several demonstrations held by the far right and replying counter protests that happen, and many of them have turned into clashes where things get violent. And what I've consistently seen is the Los Angeles Police Department, who is usually in charge of these kinds of situations, they'll try and keep the sides divided, but there's really not a proportional level of policing and aggressiveness they apply to one side versus the other. So, for example, we saw there were two pretty significant clashes over WeSpa, which is a Korean spa. There was an issue over transgender people being allowed into the spa, and it became kind of a flashpoint for right-wing panic and hatred. And there was a right-wing rally there with a lot of Proud Boys and other far-right extremists. And they were open carrying bats and pepper spray and taser guns and and knives and batons. And they weren't really hiding it from police. Police kept the sides separate as much as they could, but didn't really seem bothered by the far right openly brandishing weapons. Conversely, the side with the leftists and the counter protesters, the pro-LGBT side, they were shot at with less lethal rounds. They were baton, they were hit, and none of them were, openly carrying any weapons or acting aggressive in a way where they were starting fights. During the July 3rd WeSpa incident, there was a situation that a colleague of mine captured on film where a far-right extremist actually stabbed two people. He stabbed one leftist protester in the legs 3 times, and then stabbed one of his own far-right extremists by accident while he was getting up. And this was filmed. This was well documented by both right-wing media and left-wing media, and nothing came of it. There was no headlines about it. There was no arrests made. Even now, there has been little progression in that case. And I think what we're seeing is LAPD and police departments around the country kind of giving far-right extremists a pass with their violence. And it's making a lot of these folks on the far right, especially people like the Proud Boys, they seem to believe that they can get away with it. And that's escalated a lot of the violence on the ground here in Los Angeles, and clearly from what we've seen in Portland over the weekend as well. And unfortunately, it feels like this is becoming common. This is becoming consistent.
Shauna, the police chief of Portland said in advance that his department was going to be taking a hands-off approach, which I found to be incredible, given the amount of violence that these groups tend to bring. And of course, we on the left over here, we revolutionaries. I'm not blaming the anti-fascists at all. I'm glad the anti-fascists showed up to meet these people, but absent them being met in the streets by anti-fascists, it seems as though these groups would have just been able to just go around unabated. And I'm curious, what you observed in terms of the police, their actions. We saw that clip of them thankfully subduing an active shooter, but that's the minimum that they should have been able to do. But how did you see police interacting with the groups associated with those on the far right? And if you witnessed any violence, what was it?
So I kind of talked to you about this a little bit earlier, but I attended the Proud Boys rally early on in the day, and there were a lot of speakers, and it was just like pretty slow and pretty, it seemed like most of them were just like trying to hang out in the parking lot and like chug White Claws and, do whatever they normally do. And it was on the northeast part of Portland. There was no police from what I saw. However, I will say that I actually left for a little bit after some of the far right had given a lot of their speeches. And I came back after the interaction had happened between anti-fascists and between the far right. And I will say that when I was driving back around, that was the first time I had seen a police officer anywhere near the area, and they didn't even turn in the direction to go close to where the incident had just happened. So there was a vehicle with like an LRAD on top of it, and I thought that they would actually be going towards where the van had just been flipped and where anti-fascists and far right had faced off. But instead, they turned around and they went some other opposite direction. The first police interaction that I saw was after I went downtown and I heard all the gunshots going off and ran towards the direction of where everything was happening. And that was the very first time that day that I had actually seen police actually interfere with any sort of interaction from that day.
Yikes. That doesn't speak very well about the Portland police. Now, what was interesting, KOIN had reported that all police were required to be available that day. The reporter even said in the package that we didn't include, but she said that even if police had the day off, they had to report for work to deal with this. So it just seems as though the Portland police were there collecting overtime and actually not doing shit. I'm just curious. Hold on, Shauna. What were the speeches about, girl? Like what was the goal of the day? Like what were they there to propagate at this speech, at the speeches?
Well, what was actually interesting was that one of the speeches came from, so I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Tesla, Tiny Toes is his Proud Boys name, street name. So he was there kind of being the MC for all of this. And whenever I was there standing there, there was a so-called journalist who works for a media company. I think he's branded himself. But as a conservative journalist, he got up there and spoke in front of people and basically was trying to claim, we're not white supremacists. Like you see more diversity in this crowd than you do in anti-fascist crowds, for example. So that was like one of his big hammering points. And then he kind of went into some other things, but that was like the main one that I can really remember was him trying to focus on, look how diverse we are compared to like anti-fascist groups. And also, it's kind of strange getting up there as like somebody who's supposed to be objective as a news person and like telling a crowd of people, the liberals are, responsible for everything, for all these problems. And it's not us, it's them. So it was definitely like eye-opening in the way that I've never seen a, self-proclaimed journalist go out there and try to claim that they're like on one particular side,
Was it diverse? I'm just curious. What was the level of diversity? Now my interest is way more piqued.
No, I mean, to be honest, it was surprisingly diverse, but I will say that I feel like there was more media present than there were actual Proud Boys or like people who were there to attend the event.
Mm-hmm. Vishal, Shauna mentioned Tiny Toes, which I learned about Tiny Toes from following, portions of your Twitter feed and, following your threads and following other journalist threads who have been documenting and tracking these people. Is it generally like the same crowd of folks, of white supremacists, of, far right wing affiliated groups? Like, are these the same people showing up to the same protests? They are showing up to the anti-mask, the anti-vax, the anti-trans joints. I mean, they're just showing up at anti-everything. It would seem that way. Why is it we're seeing the exact same people? And are we noticing these numbers growing or shrinking, or what have you observed over the past couple of years of following these folks?
Sure. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. It really is a lot of times the same people. Of course, Tiny is known in the Portland and Vancouver area, but Shauna, you were talking about that conservative guy who claims to be press that was on stage. That gentleman's name is Thomas Morales. He's actually an LA-based right-winger who has been constantly on the ground here in Los Angeles and doing a lot of propaganda for the Proud Boys here. So it's interesting that they all do kind of communicate and help each other out when their numbers are low. In terms of how the numbers are doing, I see it in waves. Sometimes they have a little blow up and they get a lot of attention and they get the right perfect storm of media and Twitter rage can get them to mobilize a lot of numbers. But then other times, sometimes not a lot of folks show out and you get the same hardcore Proud Boy folks and they get outnumbered by anti-fascists and other leftist activists. So it seems it's hard to find a consistency with them, but I have noticed it's often the same people, which has made identifying them pretty easy, honestly.
And the fact that they seem very consistent when they show up, and also consistently, the police seem to take a very laissez-faire, hands-off approach to either arresting them, committing violence, or committing other sorts of crimes, or just sort of letting them go unabated. Vishal, what are some of the relationships, maybe not specific relationships, but if you know them, sure. But from what you've observed, like the way that LAPD specifically deals with these right-wing groups when they have these gatherings and they're talking shit and they're getting rowdy, like what do the cops do? I already know what they do, but I want you to tell everybody else what they do.
Yeah. LAPD does have a very laissez-faire, hands-off approach with a lot of the far-right extremist demonstrations. In Los Angeles, there's a city ordinance called 5507, which restricts a lot of items such as like blunt weapons and tasers and bear mace, pepper spray, all these things at protests. And I have seen them aggressively police that city ordinance when dealing with Black Lives Matter protests or anti-fascist protests. I've seen them just arrest random Black Lives Matter protesters, often women, and then arrest and kind of like hold up to Twitter like, oh, look, she had pepper spray on her. I'm just like, of course. Meanwhile, I see at Proud Boy events and at far-right and Trump-related events and anti-masker events, a lot of these right-wingers will open carry bear mace in front of law enforcement or pepper spray, and absolutely no response, even when it's brought to the attention of the law enforcement officer that they're breaking city ordinance 5507. They don't seem to care when it's the right wing breaking that law. Privately, though, a lot of these LAPD officers are on social media fully cooperating and following and having relationships with a lot of these right-wing demonstrators. Thomas Morales, the one who is in Portland, who's from Los Angeles, he has a lot of police officers who follow his work. They share his work often. They're big fans of him, frankly, and his media, whatever you call it. He calls it journalism. I call it propaganda. So off the record, the police are very supportive of the same politics that they do. They advocate the same things, the same recall elections. On the ground, publicly, they just hands off. They don't really do much unless things get completely out of hand, like what you saw in Portland, where there was actually exchanged gunfire. Los Angeles hasn't escalated to that point yet, but we are at the point where stabbings are getting to be regular and normalized here at these rallies, and that's creating a really dangerous atmosphere for everybody.
Mm. And Shauna, you have been covering these protests for a while now. And I mean, all throughout the Pacific Northwest, from Portland to Spokane to Tacoma to Seattle. What are you noticing any change in the numbers or in the levels of violence, or are police becoming more lackadaisical about these incidents? Like, has there been any change from what we just saw this weekend in Portland to incidents going back a year or even 2 or 3 years?
I mean, I will say that in comparison to last August 22nd, it was about the same in terms of police presence. I think that they weren't so forward with their intent not to engage with folks last year. But I will say that things have definitely changed since I first started doing this, last year. I'm here in Olympia, and we've been seeing a huge increase in even just these rallies where there are anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, and they have some of them have a propensity for violence, right? Like, there are definitely some people who bring weapons to these sorts of events. I just went to one last week at the Capitol where they were going in to threaten our governor here in the state. It's always surprising to me, just based on what I saw at the very beginning of last year at Black Lives Matter protests, where there were, hundreds of cops and there were police officers everywhere. And then seeing these various events, these anti-masker events, there's hardly ever any police there. And then this event in Portland, they specifically said that they were going to stay out of it. I think that's, I don't know. I think it's interesting, maybe a little bit telling, where they think that they see the violence. But I don't know. Those are just my observations in the last year or so.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the threats to the Washington governor. Is it Inslee? Is that the governor of Washington?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Just want to make sure I got his name right. Because I had not heard about this, Shauna, until you literally just mentioned it. And there was another time that you had appeared on this show, and literally you broke news to us that it was actually on the same day, January 6th, as the Capitol insurrection, that right-wingers, armed right-wingers showed up to the governor's mansion in Washington state and threatened violence. And I was like, wow, I had not heard that. So, to Shauna and to Vishal, let me ask you guys, as people that have been on the ground witnessing these events, and as journalists yourselves, how does what you have seen and reported upon differ than how these events are either covered locally by mainstream outlets or even nationally by mainstream outlets? My assumption is nationally, a lot of this stuff is getting ignored outright. And if it's not being ignored, it's being really framed in the wrong way. Shauna, let me start with you. I mean, having covered this, how does what you see differ than the way that the news actually ends up reporting it locally and nationally?
Well, I always kind of rely on my parents who live back in the Midwest for this type of thing to, give me the news on this, because I never really know what's going on nationally. But from what I've heard, they haven't really heard much about any of this that's happened. And I think also the difference is that there are a lot of nuances that go on in between that people aren't reporting on either, right? Like, there are small things within every sort of situation where I feel like, maybe we're getting an overall picture, but it's not exactly getting down to the meat of everything, and like getting down to why these things are happening, or like why they continue occurring, if that makes any sense.
It does. Vishal, what is your take? I think you probably have a more scathing critique of the local press, the non-independent press in Los Angeles. They don't seem to be doing this very well. And I'm talking about you, LA Times. Vishal, what are your thoughts?
So I've seen, there's two real attitudes I've seen. If the most common attitude is just to not talk about it at all. I've even talked to friends I have who work at LA Times who say they are frustrated that there's no protest beat at the paper. There's no right-wing extremism beat at the paper. Oftentimes it isn't talked about at all. And when it is talked about, I see a lack of context, and I see a lot of both sides of them, where it's like, oh, these two sides clash, but they don't really talk about who initiated the violence. They don't really talk about who got away with most of the violence. And it's frustrating. It's part of the reason why I started reporting on the ground, because I was seeing a lack of perspective, a lack of embedded journalists covering what was actually happening in Los Angeles, as not just Black Lives Matter protests were accelerating, but also almost in response, these right-wing rallies were accelerating and becoming more and more violent. It's frustrating. It's very frustrating because I understand you can't paint an entire paper with a broad brush. I know journalists who work at the same paper that have widely different perspectives on issues and events. But it seems to be the editors above their head really have a set idea of what should be talked about and what shouldn't be talked about. An example of that I would give is going back to the stabbings that have been happening over the summer in these demonstrations in LA. I count 4 stabbings that have occurred over the summer, and the media has really only reported on 1. Out of those 4 stabbings, 3 of them were committed by a far-right extremist. 1 of them was committed by a leftist. Guess what? Only the one committed by the leftist, which was the last and the most recent one, was actually reported on. And for me, I feel like they are completely leaving out the escalation, the fact that the far right is the first group that started stabbing people at these protests. And it leaves out a lot of context. You're just seen with this image of this bogeyman of Antifa stabbing people, and you don't have any of the facts of what led to that, of what brought these street fights to the level where people on either side feel comfortable using lethal force.
Vishal, well, this question is for you both, but I want to start with Vishal because obviously covering events where there is violence predicted ahead of time is very perilous for journalists, and journalists have not been spared from this violence at some of these gatherings of white supremacists. And Vishal, I don't like the fact that, they know you by name. Like, I've seen videos and they're like catcalling you and antagonizing you. And you've been attacked. You've had your equipment broken. You have been physically injured at some of these I will not call them clashes at these white supremacist gatherings. And the police have also injured you. Talk to me about, the personal risk that you take and journalists like yourselves take in order to bring these stories to the rest of us, despite the mainstream media blackout. We are watching. You understand? Like, I can't tell you both how much I'm deeply appreciative for the work that you do, because if you weren't out there, how in the hell we know that these racist, crazy white folks are out here like just going wild, literally. So Vishal, talk to me about, the personal risk that you take in order to document these instances and talk to us about these people. You know what I mean? Like you were calling these people out specifically, but conversely, they are calling you out and therefore making you a target.
Indeed. So it has become consistently more and more dangerous to start reporting on civil unrest in the United States in general. I know I'm not the only journalist who has had to speak to the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker about being assaulted, being targeted, whether it's being shot with less lethals by law enforcement, which has happened to me 3 times, or getting bones broken by police or far-right extremists. Again, both things that have happened to me. It's become normalized. And obviously I come I approach my journalism within, as an advocacy journalist. I specifically am advocating for people who I believe are not having their views properly platformed. For me, that's civil rights protesters and families of victims of police violence. And in doing that, I've kind of found myself in opposition very directly with the rise of far-right extremism, Trumpism, Proud Boys, all of that. And my journalism, I do make a point to identify these folks because I know law enforcement will not. And that has led to myself becoming a target. I've been doxxed. I've had my family's address posted online. I've had my address posted online. I've had people tell me they were going to kill me in front of my house. I've been assaulted multiple times. Just most recently, while reporting on an anti-vaxxer demonstration at Harlow, which is a restaurant in West Hollywood, which was requiring vaccines for customer entry, within about 5 minutes of me arriving on scene, I was in an alley surrounded by about 15 to 20 of these far-right extremists, and one of them immediately started punching me, and I had a concussion and fractures in my nose and the bottom of both my eye sockets. And that was coming off of just 3 weeks after the We Spa protests, where LAPD batoned my camera hand and broke my hand and my camera in the middle of reporting. And I ended up having to report for the rest of that day with just one hand. And it's frustrating because, you know, I talk about it with a lot of other journalists as well, that we're kind of becoming desensitized to these acts of violence, and you just throw on your plate carrier and you just know it's going to be a shit show and you go with it. And I think that's terrible. I don't think any of us should have to accept that this level of danger and of targeting is going to occur in regards to us just because we're there filming what happens. Just holding a camera in a situation like that is enough to make people target you.
I'm very sorry that you've had to endure that. And Jean-Pierre, do me a favor. Can you go to Vishal's Twitter page and find his cash links and drop them in the chat? Guys, if you're able to support Vishal in his obvious numerous medical expenses from dealing with cracker ass police and the racist ass white supremacists, please do what you can to help him out in that. And Shauna, you know, I talk to you very familiar, even though we have not met, because you seem very cool. So if I'm out of line, you can always correct me. But I would imagine that, you know, your white skin serves as like, you know, camouflage, right? Like they don't necessarily make you as, you know, somebody who may not be on their side, but still being out there, period, is dangerous nonetheless. What has been your experience, and what risks do you feel that you take by covering these events of these dangerous white supremacists?
Well, and actually, to Vishal's point and to your point, I was going to say something about that. I think that there is something to that. Like I, you know, maybe this isn't the proper way to look at it, but I have the ability to go into both spaces and not always feel like it's a uncomfortable situation. I mean, I was very whenever I walked into the Proud Boys rally on Sunday, for example, I was still questioned when I came in. Who are you with? You know, who do you plan to report to? These sorts of things. But I think that there is something to your point to, you know, I can still kind of navigate between these two, you know, not that I ever feel like I'm safe in any sort of situation. And you were kind of asking about like, what measures have we taken to, get more comfortable with these? I mean, I have to wear a flak jacket when I go out, right? Like that's not something that I ever thought that I would have to be dealing with. You know, I have to carry a helmet. I have to carry a gas mask. And, you know, while I do have this, you may call it like a privilege to walk in between certain spaces. It's not that there isn't like some certain level, I mean, certainly the Proud Boys are always checking, Twitter, and they're looking for the people who are talking badly about them, and they know who's talking badly about them. So it's just kind of trying to ride this line between, keeping myself safe, like reporting in a way that I feel like is honest, but also like just maintaining that. But, I certainly don't feel safe in a lot of spaces anymore, hence the bulletproof vest and like bulletproof helmet and things like that.
I mean, it's amazing what on the ground journalists who don't work for big outlets, the precautions that you all have to take in order just to report what's actually going on in the streets, especially when other more resourced news outlets won't report on what's happening and won't tell the truth. It won't be accurate. It won't give the proper context. So again, I just want to thank you both very much for what you do, for the risk that you assume in order to make sure that this shit is on the record. Like somebody is recording this, someone is watching this, someone is broadcasting this and putting it in the way and framing it in the way that it needs to be framed. And my concern is that these folks are just not going to stop at these one-off events, that, they're going to start gathering in communities of color and actually threatening real violence to people of color or people, whom they disagree with, which seems to be everybody who's not on the right. So I want to thank you both again. You guys, we've been speaking with journalist Shauna Sowersby, based out of the Pacific Northwest, and we've been speaking with journalist and documentarian Vishal Singh, who has been on the ground in Los Angeles covering these right-wing extremist gatherings, much to his own injuries, unfortunately, Vishal. And I'm so sorry that you've had to endure that and continue to endure it. But your tenacity and your bravery just blow me away. And again, like I was telling you before we went live, I mean, just the amazing group of independent journalists in Los Angeles. I mean, you all are about it. It is encouraging and inspiring to see. And I'm so glad that you guys are out there. So thank you both for making some time to talk about your experiences and to bring your coverage and your reporting of these incidents in both Portland and Los Angeles to the Burn It Down with Kim Brown audience. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you both so much. Guys.